November 29, 1909. Monday. The morning in East Orange, New Jersey turned out damp and gray. A phone call rang in the police station that forever changed the history of American criminology. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, educated, and frighteningly cold. The woman reported that an accident had occurred at house number 89 on 14th Street. When Deputy Coroner Dr. Herbert Simmons arrived at the address, he expected to see an ordinary family tragedy. Heart attack, fall from the stairs, possibly illness. But what appeared before his eyes more resembled the sets of a Gothic horror film that would be shot only half a century later. The house was almost empty. In the huge mansion, there were no carpets, no paintings, no cozy armchairs. Instead of chairs, overturned barrels were used. The windows were draped with thick fabric that did not let in sunlight. The temperature inside barely exceeded the outdoor one. It seemed that no one lived there, but in the center of the living room sat three women. They were dressed in high-necked black dresses of the Victorian era, covered from head to toe with mourning veils. Three sisters: Virginia Wardlaw, Mary Snyder, Caroline Martin. They sat motionless, like stone statues, and were silent. Their faces under the veils showed neither grief nor fear, only the icy calm of people who are confident in their superiority. Dr. Simmons went up to the second floor. In the bathroom, in an old zinc bathtub filled with cold water, lay a body. It was a young woman curled up. Her name was Ossie Snyder. She was 24 years old, but she looked like a deep old woman or a victim of medieval famine. At the height of an adult, she weighed only 35 kilograms. The skin clung to the bones so tightly that every rib could be counted. Her face was frozen in a grimace of a silent scream, and in her dry, bird's claw-like hand was clutched a washcloth. On the bathroom floor lay a note, written in unsteady handwriting. It said, "Rejoice with me, that death brings me blessed relief from pain." It looked like a suicide's farewell note, a perfect alibi. But Dr. Simmons was an experienced man. He saw bruises on the body. He noticed that the girl's hair was dry, although she was lying in water. He realized that she had been placed in the bathtub already dead. This was not suicide. This was an execution. But the most shocking was not the body itself, but the context. The women downstairs, in black veils, were not street bandits or mad recluses. They were pillars of society, daughters of a wealthy and respected family from the South. Virginia Wardlaw was a renowned educator, director of a prestigious women's college. They spoke impeccable English, quoted the classics, and wore family heirloom jewelry under their mourning attire. How did it happen that these aristocrats, called to sow the rational and eternal, turned their home into a tomb? The answer lay in the sum for which all this was undertaken: $32,000. The life of the unfortunate Ossie Snyder was insured for exactly that amount. In modern money, that's more than $1,100,000. $1 million for the life of their own niece and daughter. On the day the police led the sisters out of the house, the crowd on the street buzzed. Newspaper reporters already smelled a sensation. This case would become the first reality show in United States history about the fall of high society. Long before the O.J. Simpson trial or the Menendez brothers, America breathlessly followed the Sisters in Black. Newspapers would call them witches, vampires, monsters in human guise. But the truth was far scarier than mysticism. This was a story not about ghosts, but about banal, all-consuming greed. about how the desire to maintain the appearance of a luxurious life pushes people beyond the bounds of humanity. They were confident that their background and manners would protect them from the electric chair. They looked at the police like servants who dared to enter the master's bedroom without knocking. But under the black silks hid not ladies, but cold, calculating predators who had already spent the future insurance payouts to pay off their debts. On that Monday, the world saw the finale of this story. We saw the denouement, a corpse in the bathtub and 3 women in black. But to understand how they reached such a degree of moral decay, we need to rewind the tape back. We need to go back to the times when the Wardlaw name sounded proudly, when balls resounded with music and the future seemed cloudless and golden. We are heading into the past, where the foundation of this house of death was laid. There, where the ambitions of one family began to devour its own children. To understand how 3 women with impeccable reputations turned into angels of death, we must leave the cold and damp New Jersey of the early 20th century and travel back in time and south. Our story begins not in the dirty alleys where crime usually originates, but in the shady avenues of old Virginia and Tennessee, where the air smells of magnolias and family honor is valued more than gold. Here, in the heart of the American South, the Wardlaw name sounded like a password to high society. Their father was not just the head of the family, he was a monument of his era. John Wardlaw, state Supreme Court judge and clergyman, a man in whose hands were both earthly law and divine law. He built for his daughters a world where they were not just women, but the chosen ones. While most girls of their class learned only to embroider and play the piano, the Wardlaw sisters received an education available to few men. They read Latin, understood jurisprudence and theology. Their father instilled in them a simple but dangerous idea that would become the cornerstone of their future tragedy. They are special. They stand above the crowd, and the rules written for ordinary people do not apply to them. The eldest sister, Virginia Wardlaw, absorbed this lesson the deepest. She was not a beauty in the conventional understanding of that time. Her face was stern, her gaze piercing and commanding. She refused the traditional role of wife and mother, choosing the path of power. In her character blended her father's iron will and cold calculation, which would later be called sociopathy. It was Virginia who became the architect of the family's well-being after the patriarch's death. She understood that the old Southern money was melting like ice in the sun, and to maintain status, she needed to create her own kingdom. This kingdom became the Montgomery Women's College in Christiansburg. It was not just an educational institution. It was a citadel of Victorian morality and aristocratic upbringing. Virginia Wardlaw took the position of director, and her sisters, Mary and Caroline, became her loyal lieutenants. Imagine this place. Majestic brick buildings, manicured gardens, the silence of libraries, and hundreds of girls from the best families whose parents paid huge sums so that their daughters could touch the magic of the Wardlaw name. In these years, which can be called the family's golden era, the sisters were at the top of the world. They were queens of their small state. Virginia ruled with an iron hand. She was respected, feared, admired. She walked the college corridors like an admiral on the deck of a flagship. Parents of the students lined up just to talk to her. It seemed that this success would be eternal. Money flowed like a river. Tuition fees, donations, income from real estate. They lived in a world where any of their desires was fulfilled instantly. But already then, in those years of triumph, An attentive observer might have noticed the first cracks in the foundation. The sisters' strange seclusion. Their painful attachment to each other, excluding outsiders. They dressed identically, spoke in the same phrases, and often finished each other's sentences. There was something almost mystical in their relationship. A closed club of 3 people, where entry was forbidden even to husbands. Caroline, the youngest of the sisters, married Colonel Martin, but this marriage seemed merely an annoying formality. Shortly after the wedding, she gave birth to a daughter, Oceana, whom they called simply Ozzy at home. The girl who was destined to become the victim in the bathtub was born a princess of this pedagogical empire. From her first days of life, she was surrounded by nannies, governesses, and the all-consuming, suffocating love of her mother and aunts. They looked at her not as an independent person, but as property, as a precious doll to play with by their own rules. Mary Snyder also married, and also gave birth to a son, Fletcher. The irony of fate and the genetic trap snapped shut when the cousins, Fletcher and Ossie, later became husband and wife. But while they were children running through the college corridors, no one could imagine the nightmare awaiting them in the future. The Wardlaw Empire rested on prestige, but prestige is a currency subject to inflation. At the end of the 19th century, the world began to change. New educational methods, new values, emancipation. All this clashed with the conservative, almost medieval order of Montgomery College. The flow of students began to thin. Incomes fell. But the Wardlaw sisters did not know how and did not want to cut expenses. They were accustomed to living large, accustomed to the best fabrics, to silverware, to travels. Virginia Wardlaw, accustomed to being a winner, could not admit defeat. She perceived financial difficulties not as a signal to economize, but as a personal insult from the universe. Instead of restructuring the business model, she began to borrow. First from banks, then from acquaintances, then using the college property as collateral. She was confident that it was temporary, that her genius and family name would pull them out of any pit. This was the classic mistake of aristocracy, the belief that their status is a guarantee of solvency. It was at this moment, when the walls of their empire began to shake, that a terrible shift occurred in the sisters' psychology. They began to perceive the surrounding world as an enemy. Everyone who demanded the return of debts became traitors. Everyone who doubted their greatness became ill-wishers. Their circle of communication narrowed to the extreme. They began to wear black not for mourning, but as the uniform of their order, as armor separating them from the plebeians. Inside the family, a distorted morality began to form. If the world is unfair to us, they decided, then we have the right to take ours by force or cunning. They began to view the people around them not as living souls, but as resources, and the most accessible resources were their own children and relatives. The first alarming signal was the strange death of Caroline's young son, Hugh Martin. The boy fell from the stairs, or at least that's what the official version stated. The family received $22,000 in insurance, a huge sum that allowed them to plug the holes in the college budget for a couple more years. No one asked questions then. Who would dare suspect a grieving mother and a respected college director? Coroners expressed condolences. Neighbors brought flowers. But it was then that the sisters realized a terrible thing. Death can be profitable. Death pays better than life. This check from the insurance company became the first dose of the drug they got hooked on. Easy money. Money that requires no labor, only a bit of acting and a lack of conscience. Thus, on the ruins of the pedagogical empire, a new empire began to be built. The empire of insurance fraud. Virginia, Mary, and Caroline did not yet know that this path would lead them to the cold house in New Jersey. They still believed they were saving their legacy, but in reality, they had already begun digging the grave for their family. Montgomery College, once a temple of knowledge, was turning into a facade behind which hid debts, lies, and an emerging conspiracy. The founders, called to educate noble young ladies, began turning into predators for whom human life has a clear price tag in dollars and cents. At the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, while the rest of the world was racing toward progress, in the walls of Montgomery College, time seemed to freeze in sweet syrup. For an outside observer, it was the true golden age of the Wardlaw clan. The sisters perfected the art of social mimicry. They created such a dense aura of respectability around themselves that it never occurred to anyone to demand accountability from them. At the center of this artificial paradise grew Oceana Wardlaw Martin, or simply Ozzie. If the sisters were the architects of the empire, then Ozzie was meant to become its main treasure, the living embodiment of their success. The girl grew up not just as a child, but as a project. Her upbringing resembled the cultivation of a rare orchid in an airless space. She was forbidden to play with ordinary children, run around, or soil her dresses. Instead of children's games, endless lessons in music, French, and etiquette. Ozzie was incredibly talented. By 16 years old, she knew several languages, wrote poetry, and possessed encyclopedic knowledge. But these were knowledge detached from reality. She could quote Dante in the original, but did not know how to buy a train ticket or the price of a loaf of bread. Aunt Virginia and Mother Caroline molded her into the ideal aristocrat, but in the process, they broke her will. They instilled in her that the outside world is dangerous, dirty, and hostile, and only the family is her sole fortress. This was the time when the sisters' madness began to take the form of luxury. Although college revenues were falling, spending on maintaining status only grew. This was the classic trap of the Gilded Age. The worse things got, the brighter the facade had to shine. Virginia Wardlaw ordered dresses from Paris catalogs, wore silks that cost as much as a worker's annual salary. They hosted receptions where tables groaned under delicacies, and silver was polished to a mirror shine. Every such dinner was a performance. The sisters sat at the head of the table, engaging in small talk, while in the director's office, unpaid bills from butchers, grocers, and tailors piled up. They lived on the principle of a financial pyramid, taking out new loans to pay interest on old ones, and borrowing from parents of new students, promising privileges that cost nothing. But the most cynical move in this game became the personal lives of the heirs. When Ozzie and her cousin Fletcher Snyder grew up, the sisters made a decision that would shock anyone outside their closed world, but seemed absolutely logical within it. They decided to marry the first cousins. Officially, this was presented as the union of two loving hearts. In reality, it was a business deal, a merger of assets, an attempt to keep the capital within the family. Fletcher was the son of Mary Snyder. Ozzie was the daughter of Caroline Martin. Their marriage closed the circle. No outsiders, no strangers who could peek into the accounting books or ask uncomfortable questions about the aunt's strange habits. The wedding was staged with pomp worthy of a royal family, although there was effectively no money for it. Ozzie stood at the altar in a luxurious dress, but her eyes already betrayed a sense of doom at that time. She was marrying not a man, but a system. Fletcher, a handsome but weak-willed young man, was completely under the influence of his mother and the domineering Aunt Virginia. He was not a protective husband, but just another puppet in their hands. After the wedding, the young couple did not gain freedom. On the contrary, control intensified. Now the sisters had a legal reason to manage not only Aussie's life, but also her property. And there was property. Despite the debts, some assets, remnants of her father's and grandmother's inheritance, were registered in Aussie's name. But the main thing, they began to issue the first insurance policies on her, still small, experimental ones. The sisters seemed to be trying it on, assessing how much this fragile life could cost on the death market. It was precisely in this period of the Gilded Age that the terrible contrast between external splendor and internal rot began to manifest. Whispers started in the college. Students noticed oddities. Director Virginia could stand by the window for hours talking to herself. Caroline would fly into hysterics over a stain on the tablecloth. Mary, the eternal shadow, silently glided through the corridors, eavesdropping on the servants' conversations. The atmosphere in the house was becoming suffocating. Luxurious carpets absorbed not only dust, but also fear. Aussie began to get sick. At first, it was just migraines and weakness. The doctors whom the sisters invited, always different so no one would suspect anything, threw up their hands. They prescribed tonics, rest, and morphine, the universal medicine of that era. Morphine became an invisible family member. It calmed Caroline's nerves, dulled Fletcher's suspicions, and made Aussie compliant. Under the influence of opiates, reality blurred. Debts seemed unimportant. The aunt's strange requests to sign some papers, insignificant. The sisters realized that a weak, sick heiress was much more convenient than a healthy and active one. Aussie's illness became their new project. By 1908, the financial bubble of Montgomery College burst. Creditors no longer believed promises. Banks threatened lawsuits. The reputation was ruined. Any other family would have admitted bankruptcy, sold the property, and tried to start a new life from scratch. But not the Wardlaws. For Virginia, admitting poverty was worse than death. She made a decision that became the beginning of the end. The family must flee. Not just move, but disappear, and be reborn in a new place where no one knows about their debts. They packed their things. Not all, only the most valuable. Silver, jewelry, and, of course, the insurance documents. They left Virginia at night, like thieves, leaving behind the ruined college, the cheated suppliers, and their reputation. They were heading north, to New York, to the city of big money and big opportunities. They believed that there, in the metropolis, they would become queens again. But they brought not only suitcases with them, they brought their pride, their madness, and the pregnant Aussie, whose life was already scheduled minute by minute in their devilish plan. The golden age was over. The era of survival at any cost was dawning. And in this new era, Aussie Snyder was about to learn that the scariest monsters do not live in fairy tales, but in the next room, and call you dear little daughter. New York of 1908 did not believe tears, did not respect ancient surnames, and spat on Southern manners. It was a monster city, a machine city, grinding fates at the speed of the under-construction subway. Here, into this boiling cauldron of ambitions, arrived the three Wardlaw sisters, dragging with them the pregnant Aussie, the bewildered Fletcher, and a heap of unpaid promissory notes. In their imagination, this was a triumphant return. Virginia Wardlaw sincerely believed that New York would fall at her feet as easily as the parents of students in Virginia had once done. She planned to enter high society not through the back door, but through the grand entrance. But she made a fatal mistake. She tried to play poker with the city that invented card sharping. A strange, surreal social war began. The sisters declared a boycott on reality. Their tactic became guerrilla luxury. They could not afford to buy a mansion, so they began renting the most expensive apartments they could find. Upper West Side, Riverside Drive, addresses where bankers and industrial magnates lived. The sisters came to realtors in their impeccable mourning outfits. Virginia, with the posture of a queen, spoke of temporary difficulties with transferring capital from southern banks, charmed the managers with her perfect English, and signed lease agreements. They believed her. After all, who would suspect three elderly ladies in black of fraud? But as soon as the doors slammed shut, the masks fell off. What happened inside these luxurious apartments resembled the life of refugees or occupiers more than anything. They had no money for furniture. In the huge halls with stucco and views of the Hudson, there were no tables or beds. They slept on the floor, on heaps of old clothes, covering themselves with coats. They ate canned food, sitting on crates in rooms intended for balls. This was a grotesque contrast. Outside, a prestigious address. Inside, a bivouac of beggars. Neighbors, the true elite of New York, old money like the Astors and Vanderbilts, did not even notice their existence. And if they did notice, it was with disgust. For New York high society, the Wardlaws were nobody. Dust on the soles of progress. This coldness of high society was driving Virginia mad. She could not understand why her title of renowned educator was not valued here. In response to the city's indifference, the sisters erected a wall of alienation around themselves. It was here, in New York, that their frightening image of the sisters in black finally formed. They began to wear thick veils hiding their faces. At first, it was a way to hide from creditors who were becoming more numerous. Then, it turned into a lifestyle. 3 black figures silently gliding along Broadway became an urban legend. People turned to look after them, whispering about witches and evil spirits. But the sisters took this fear for respect. In this stifling atmosphere of social isolation, Ozzie gave birth to a child, a little boy. It would seem that the arrival of new life should have melted the ice in the women's hearts, but the child became just another problem. In their nomadic life, full of moves from one unpaid apartment to another, there was no place for an infant. He was given to the hospital almost immediately, and then handed over to strangers altogether. The maternal instinct in this family atrophied completely. Only the instinct for self-preservation remained. Fletcher Snyder, Ozzie's husband, tried to find work but quickly broke down. New York required grit that the pampered Southern youth did not have. He felt the aunt's web tightening around him. He saw that his wife was fading, turning into a shadow, but he was too weak to resist his mother and aunt. Virginia and Mary convinced him that Ozzie was ill, that she needed peace, not a husband. They slowly, methodically pushed him away from his wife, turning Ozzie into their sole property. The social war was lost. Instead of balls and receptions, bailiffs awaited them. Apartment owners, not receiving rent, started eviction proceedings. The sisters learned to escape virtuosically. They moved out at night, leaving keys on the empty floor, and relocated to a new district to repeat the scheme again. Brooklyn, Manhattan, Brooklyn again. The circle was narrowing. Their names got into the blacklists of real estate agencies. Newspapers began printing notes about the strange women in veils who deceive landlords. The aura of mystery was replaced by the smell of scandal. It became clear. New York rejected them. The city chewed their ambitions and spat them out. They needed to flee further, to where they were still unknown, to the suburbs, to the silence, to the darkness. It was then that Virginia made the decision to move to New Jersey, to East Orange. It was quieter there, rent cheaper, and the police more provincial. But this retreat meant a change of strategy. If they could not earn on life, through status, school, social ascent, then it was time to earn on death. In fact, the move to New Jersey marked the end of their attempts to be part of society. They declared war on the whole world. Now, only their microcosm existed. 3 sisters and the golden antelope, the dying Aussie. Social elevators were turned off. Only the staircase leading to the basement of madness remained. Aussie Snyder, who had once been the family's hope, was now just an asset, a living promissory note. The sisters looked at her and saw not blood kin, but numbers. Insurance agents became their new best friends. The war for status was over. The war for the insurance payout began. And in this war, no prisoners were taken. If in New York the Wardlaw sisters suffered defeat on the field of social battle, then in the financial world they were preparing to execute their main, most monstrous maneuver. History knows many examples of marriages of convenience from that era, when American millionairesses married impoverished British dukes, exchanging fathers' dollars for titles. This was called the deal of the century. But what Virginia, Mary, and Caroline devised was a much darker version of business. They decided not to buy the future, but to sell it. They looked at their family not as people, but as an investment portfolio. And the most liquid asset in this portfolio was the young, fragile Aussie Snyder. To understand the mechanics of this crime, one must look into the accounting books of the past. Several years before the events in East Orange, a tragedy occurred in the family that became the dress rehearsal for the current nightmare. Caroline's son, 7-year-old Hugh Martin, died under very murky circumstances. Officially, an accident. But the outcome of this death was an insurance payout of $22,000. In modern money, that's about $750,000. $750,000 for a child's life. For the sisters, drowning in college debts, this money became a revelation. They realized dead relatives bring income. Living ones, only expenses. Hugh Martin paid for their luxurious life for several years ahead with his death. Now, when the money from the boy's death ran out, they needed a new donor. Aussie Snyder fit perfectly. The operation began with frightening methodicalness. This was not a spontaneous decision. This was a corporate strategy. First, it was necessary to ensure the legal purity of the deal. It was for this that Aussie's marriage to her cousin Fletcher was needed. Under the law, husband and wife had the right to insure each other's lives for the benefit of the family. The marriage locked the assets within the circle of the 3 sisters. Then, the hunt for policies began. Virginia Wardlaw, using her authority and gift of persuasion, began methodically visiting insurance offices. She took out policy after policy in her niece's name. $1,000, $5,000, $10,000. Agents saw before them a respectable elderly lady, caring for her beloved relative's future. It never occurred to them that they were signing a death sentence. In total, Aussie's life was insured for $32,000. At 2024 rates, that's more than $1,100,000. $1 million. This figure made the sisters' heads spin. It was their ticket back to high society, the opportunity to pay off debts and reopen the school. On one side of the scales lay the life of a depressive, weak girl. On the other, $1 million, and the return of the Wardlaw name's greatness. The choice for them was obvious. But this business scheme had one critical flaw: insurance premiums. To keep the policies active, premiums had to be paid regularly. And here begins the most surreal stage of their financial agony. The sisters were bankrupt. They had no money for food, but they were obligated to pay the insurers. Otherwise, the deal of the century would fall through. We see scenes worthy of Dostoevsky's pen. 3 women in black come to pawn shops. They pawn their last family heirlooms: diamond rings, gold watches, heavy silver brooches. All this goes for a pittance to pay the next premium for Aussie's insurance. When the jewelry ran out, they began selling clothes. They literally took off their dresses to pay for their niece's death. This was a race against time. They invested everything they had into Aussie's death. Every day of the girl's life cost them money they didn't have. Aussie had to die, and die quickly. Otherwise, the whole scheme would collapse under the weight of unpaid premiums. And what about Aussie herself? She was an obedient doll in their hands. Under the influence of morphine and constant psychological pressure, she signed any papers that Aunt Virginia shoved under her nose. "It's for your own good, dear," the insinuating voice said. And Aussie, barely holding the pen with her weakening hand, put her signature. She bequeathed her body to science, and her death to her mother and aunt's wallet. But one problem remained: Fletcher Snyder, the husband. Formally, he could claim part of the money, or, worse, start asking questions about the methods of treating his wife. The sisters solved this problem in their style. Fletcher was a weak man, and they broke him. They convinced him that he was a failure, that he could not support the family, and the best he could do was disappear. Fletcher Snyder fled to Canada under the fictitious name John Lucas. He worked as a dishwasher in a cheap diner, while his wife slowly died in New Jersey. His escape freed the sisters' hands. Now no one stood between them and Aussie. By the fall of 1909, the financial noose tightened to the limit. The sisters pawned everything. They starved themselves, saving every cent for insurance premiums. The math of murder became merciless. Assets, Aussie, must be liquidated before liabilities exceed potential profit. They looked at the weakening girl not with compassion, but with the impatience of a creditor awaiting payment. The deal was sealed, papers signed, underwriters in insurance companies put their seals. All that remained was to execute the contract. And for that, they needed the perfect testing ground. A house where no one would hear screams. A house that would become the final point in this cynical business strategy. October 1909. We approach house number 89 on 14th Street in East Orange. From the outside, this building looked quite respectable. A typical mansion for the upper middle class. 2 stories, spacious veranda, well-groomed lawn that still remembered the gardener's hands. For neighbors, it was just another house where quiet, pious women had settled. But if walls could talk, they wouldn't scream. They would whisper in horror. This house became the physical embodiment of the Wardlaw sisters' soul, a decent facade hiding absolute emptiness inside. When we open the front door, we are greeted not by the warmth of a home hearth, but by icy cold and hollow echo. Inside, there was nothing. Literally. Imagine 18 rooms from which life had disappeared. There were no heavy Victorian drapes, plush sofas, oak tables, or bookcases. All of this had been sold or pawned. In the huge living room, where by design a grand piano should have stood and guests gathered, drafts wandered. Instead of furniture, the sisters used trash. In the center of the room stood several overturned wooden barrels and soap crates. These were their chairs and tables. 3 women in black silks worth hundreds of dollars sat on dirty crates, backs straight, as if at a reception with the Queen. This surreal contrast, aristocratic posture against a backdrop of poverty, frightened more than outright rags. The windows were tightly draped with thick fabric, sometimes just old blankets nailed to the frames. Sunlight did not penetrate inside. Eternal twilight reigned in the house. Time had stopped here. There were no clocks, no daily routine, only an endless cycle of waiting. The temperature in the house barely differed from the outdoor one. The sisters had no money for coal to heat the stoves. Breath came out in steam. To warm up, they put on all their available dresses at once, layer upon layer, turning into shapeless black cocoons. But the cold was not only physical. It was the cold of total alienation. The kitchen, the heart of any home, was dead here. The stove stood cold. No smells of roasted meat or fresh bread. The family's diet consisted of dry crackers, cheap cookies, and sometimes milk. They ate silently, mechanically, just to maintain strength. The only thing they did not skimp on was medicines for Aussie. Morphine. Let us go up to the second floor. The stairs creak underfoot, breaking the deathly silence. Here was Aussie Snyder's room. It was not a bedroom, but a solitary cell. The girl lay on a mattress thrown directly on the floor. She did not even have a pillow. Instead, they used a rolled-up coat. In this room, the architecture of loneliness reached its peak. The walls pressed in. Aussie, weakened by hunger and drugs, stared at one spot on the ceiling for hours. Her world had shrunk to the size of this mattress. She saw no sky, no trees, no people. Only the black figures of her aunts, who silently appeared in the doorway, like ghost wardens. There were no servants in the house. Virginia's pride did not allow hiring someone who would see their humiliation, and there was nothing to pay with anyway. So the sisters themselves performed the role of servants. But it was a perverted form of care. They brought water, changed linens, but did it with the cold detachment of morgue orderlies. They cared not for a person, but for an insurance object, ensuring it did not spoil prematurely, but also did not recover. The bathroom held a special place in this architecture, the very one where everything would end. In it stood an old zinc bathtub with peeling paint. The plumbing worked poorly. The water came rusty and icy. This room was the coldest in the house. The tile on the floor was icy to the touch. It was precisely here, into this tiled crypt, that the sisters planned to bring their victim. The house in East Orange became the third, invisible participant in the conspiracy. It isolated the victim from cries for help. Its walls muffled sounds. Its draped windows hid the crime. Neighbors saw only dark silhouettes flashing behind the glass and thought they were grieving widows. No one could imagine that 5 meters from their well-groomed front yards, in the darkness and cold, on the floor lay a young woman slowly dying of hunger, surrounded by 3 mad relatives. This was a trap house, a tomb house. No one lived here. They slowly faded here. In these empty rooms, among barrels and shadows, Virginia, Mary, and Carolyn finally lost touch with humanity. The architecture of their daily life reflected the architecture of their souls. A majestic facade outside, and frightening cold emptiness inside, where the only inhabitant was greed. Now, with the scenery set and the stage lit by the dim light of a gas mantle, we are ready to peer into the darkest abyss. We turn to what was happening in these women's minds. to the rot that ate them from inside faster than dampness ate the wallpaper of this cursed house. If the walls of the house in East Orange were cold, then the atmosphere inside it was saturated with poison. We have reached the darkest chapter of this family chronicle, to the moment when ambitions finally grew into pathology and family ties turned into a noose. Rot, here, is not only a metaphor for moral decay, it is a literal description of what was happening to Aussie Snyder's body and mind. The sisters' main tool of control was neither carrot nor stick, but a small pharmacy vial. Morphine. In the early 20th century, opiates were sold freely, and Virginia Wardlaw bought them on an industrial scale. To the outside world, it was medicine for the sick and nervous niece. In reality, it was a chemical leash. Aussie was kept in a state of constant narcotic fog. Morphine suppressed the will, dulled the sense of hunger, and erased the boundaries of reality. The girl lay in a semi-daze for days on end, while her body slowly devoured itself. This was a perfectly staged process of personality destruction. The sisters instilled in her that she was insane, that she was incapable of living independently, that only they were her sole protection from the hostile world. The most terrifying figure in this triangle of evil was Caroline Martin, Aussie's own mother. Nature had implanted in the woman an instinct to protect her offspring, but in Caroline's case, this mechanism suffered a monstrous failure. She did not simply watch her daughter's fading, she actively contributed to it. Witnesses would later recount that Caroline could sit by her daughter's bedside for hours with a stone face, watching as she begged for food, and reply, "It's harmful for you, dear. It's for your own good." Hunger was the second weapon. Aussie's diet was cut to absurdity. 1 cracker a day, a cup of diluted milk. Sometimes, nothing. Meanwhile, the sisters themselves, though living poorly, ate better. This was food torture. Aussie was turning into a living skeleton. Her skin became translucent. Her hair began to fall out. But every time she gathered strength to rebel, a new dose of medicine followed. But even in this hell, moments of clarity occurred. The rot had not eaten everything. Aussie's survival instinct tried to break through the narcotic haze. There was an episode that could have saved her life if the indifference of those around her had not proven stronger. Shortly before her death, Aussie managed to send a message to the outside world. She tried to contact a lawyer named Giuseppe Caraba. It was a cry for help disguised as a legal consultation. When Caraba came to the house, he was shocked by the sight of his client. Before him sat a shadow of a person wrapped in blankets. Aussie tried to tell him that she was being held captive, that she wanted to change her will, that she was afraid. But then Virginia Wardlaw stepped in. The clan leader staged a brilliant performance before the lawyer. With a sad smile, she explained that her poor niece suffered from hallucinations, that she was mentally unstable and often made up scary stories. Virginia spoke so convincingly, so intelligently, with such genuine concern, that the lawyer believed her, not the victim. "We're doing everything possible for our girl," Virginia said, escorting the lawyer to the door, and the door slammed shut. This was Aussie's last chance. Society, hypnotized by the manners of the noble ladies, refused to see the crime right under its nose. The rot was growing inside the clan itself as well. The relationships between the sisters resembled a jar of spiders. They were bound by a common crime, but hated and feared each other. They slept in turns, fearing that someone would run away with the remaining money. Their conversations consisted of whispers and hints. They began to believe their own lie. It seemed to them that they were not murderers, but martyrs bearing a heavy cross. This psychological defense allowed them to look into the dying Aussie's eyes and feel nothing but irritation that she was dying too slowly. By November 1909, the situation reached a critical point. The money had completely run out. There was nothing to pay for the house rent. The landlord was already threatening eviction. The insurance premium had to be paid in a week, otherwise the policies would expire. Time had run out. Aussie Snyder was still alive, but she had become a burden. The rot behind the facade broke through to the surface. It was no longer possible to wait for natural death from exhaustion. Nature proved too resilient. Aussie's 24-year-old heart continued to beat despite everything.
And this heart needed to be stopped forcibly. The sisters realized that the passive phase of murder, hunger, and neglect had not worked as quickly as the business plan required. They needed to move to active measures. The moral barrier had long been crossed. For them, Aussie was already dead. She was just an error in the accounting that needed to be corrected. In the last days before the finale, a sinister bustle reigned in the house. The sisters discussed something behind closed doors. Aussie, lying on her mattress, felt the air thickening. She was too weak to get up, but her mind, cleared of morphine due to lack of money for a new dose, understood everything. She knew the end was near. The rot destroyed everything: love, family, honor. Only naked, cynical calculation remained, and 3 black figures bent over the bathtub, ready to commit what would forever inscribe their names in the history of criminology. On November 29, 1909, the Wardlaw family story reached its icy finale. It was the day when the math of death converged at one point. In the bathroom, on the 2nd floor of the house in East Orange. The morning began not with screams of horror, but with a frighteningly calm phone call. Virginia Wardlow's voice was even, devoid of tremor. She called the doctor, reporting that an accident had occurred with her niece. No panic, no hysteria, just a notification, as if she were informing the laundry that the linens were ready for pickup. When Deputy Coroner Dr. Herbert Simmons crossed the threshold of the house, he was hit by a grave cold. But even scarier was the silence. In the living room, sitting on those very overturned crates, 3 figures in black awaited him. They did not rush to him with pleas to save the girl. They sat motionless, hands folded on their knees, resembling judges awaiting the reading of the verdict. Virginia merely nodded toward the stairs. "She is upstairs." Dr. Simmons went up to the 2nd floor. What he saw made even the experienced physician freeze. In the cramped bathroom, in the old zinc bathtub filled with water, lay Aussie Snyder's body. But this was not just the body of a drowning victim. It was an anatomical map of hunger. The girl was naked, and her emaciation was so monstrous that it seemed impossible for a living being. At the height of an adult woman, she weighed only about 35 kilograms. Parchment-like skin stretched over the sharp angles of bones. Her stomach had caved in toward the spine. She lay on her side, curled into an embryonic pose. Her head was tilted toward the water, but, and this was the detail that immediately shattered the sisters' entire legend, her hair was practically dry. Simmons approached closer. The picture the sisters tried to paint was clear. The unfortunate, sick girl, unable to endure her suffering, decided to end her life. Next to the bathtub, neatly pinned to her clothes, according to other accounts, lying on the floor, was a suicide note. The text was written in Aussie's trembling hand, but the style was unmistakably recognizable. It was Virginia's pompous, biblical prose.
"Rejoice with me that death brings me blessed relief from pain," the note read. This was not a cry from the soul. This was a script, an alibi written under dictation. In the dead girl's hand was clutched a washcloth. The sisters wanted to show that she was bathing and simply fell asleep or lost consciousness. But Dr. Simmons knew. People do not die so neatly. Drowning is chaos, a struggle for air, instinctive attempts to save oneself. Here, there was absolute stillness. The on-site medical examination revealed even more horrifying details. On Ossie's body, on her fragile thighs and arms, there were bruises. Fresh hematomas indicating that she had been dragged or held by force. There was almost no water in her lungs. This meant one thing. She did not drown. She died, or was killed, before being placed in the water. Most likely, Ossie's heart, tormented by years of hunger and morphine overdoses, simply stopped. Or perhaps they helped her stop when they realized time was up. The bathtub was merely a decoration, a clumsy attempt to pass off murder as suicide to avoid a police investigation and collect the insurance faster. Simmons went downstairs. 3 pairs of eyes stared at him through black veils. "Is she dead?" asked Caroline Martin, Ossie's mother. There were no tears in her voice. "Yes," the doctor replied. "This is God's mercy," Virginia said. "She suffered so much. Now she is free." At that moment, tension hung in the room, dense as fog. The sisters expected the doctor to issue a death certificate for heart failure and leave. They were already mentally dividing the $32,000. They were confident their performance had succeeded. After all, who would dare suspect the noble Wardlaw ladies of anything criminal? But Dr. Simmons did what was not in their script. He approached the telephone and asked to be connected to the police. "This is not suicide," he said into the receiver, looking straight into Virginia's eyes. "Send the coroner and detectives. This is murder." The masks were torn off. The point of no return was crossed. For the first time in many years, the sisters' absolute power over reality cracked. Their house of death ceased to be a fortress and became a crime scene. When the police began carrying out Ossie's body wrapped in a sheet, it was so light that one officer could have carried it in his arms like a child. On the street, onlookers were already gathering. The news of the skeleton girl and black widows spread through East Orange at the speed of fire. The sisters stood by the window, watching their investment leave the house. They did not understand where they went wrong. In their perverted logic, they had done everything right. They saved Ossie from earthly suffering and secured the family's future. Why then did the world look at them not with gratitude, but with horror? They did not yet know that the autopsy would show a complete absence of food in the victim's stomach and a lethal concentration of morphine in her blood. They did not know that this day would become the beginning of one of the most sensational trials of the century. They thought it was just an annoying delay before the check payout. But in reality, at the moment the door closed behind Ossie's body, the lid of the coffin slammed shut over their own fate as well. The great fall, toward which they had been heading for years, began. The Wardlaw empire collapsed, leaving behind only a corpse in the bathtub and unpaid bills. As soon as Ossie Snyder's body left house number 89, the invisible dome that had protected the Wardlaw sisters from reality burst with a deafening crack. What followed became the first example in American history of true media cannibalism. If before the sisters had fought for status in high society, now they got it. But not at all as they dreamed. They became the main celebrities of the country. Sisters in Black, Witches of East Orange, lace murderers. Newspaper headlines screamed from every corner, from New York to San Francisco. This was the Great Crash. But it began not with a judge's verdict, but with the collapse of their financial illusion. The math of the curse worked flawlessly. Their entire monstrous plan was built on one variable: quick insurance payout. They expected to receive a check for $32,000 within a month after Ozzy's suicide. But instead of a check, they received arrest warrants and lawsuits from insurance companies. The insurers, the very people who had smilingly issued policies to Virginia, now turned into sharks. As soon as the police classified the case as murder, all policies were annulled. The contracts, for which the sisters sold their jewelry, their conscience, and their own daughter's life, turned into useless scrap paper. Not a cent, not a single penny. The deal of the century turned into complete bankruptcy. The sisters' arrest became a national show. They were led out of the house under the flashes of photographers' magnesium lamps. The crowd gathered on 14th Street whistled and hooted. People who yesterday respectfully nodded to the pious widows now thirsted for their blood. But even in handcuffs, Virginia Wardlaw tried to save face. She walked with her head held high, looking through the crowd with the disdain of a deposed monarch. She still believed it was a mistake, that her intellect and family name would allow her to outplay the police plebeians. They were placed in Essex County Jail. For women accustomed to silks and, even if imaginary, grandeur, it was hell. Dirty cells, rough prison garb, food they wouldn't give even to a dog.
But here the iron will of the eldest sister manifested. Virginia Wardlaw realized she had lost the legal battle.
The evidence was irrefutable. Ozzy's body, doctors' testimonies, lack of food in the house. And then she decided to win the last moral victory. She decided to leave on her own terms. Virginia announced a hunger strike. This was not a political action, but an act of absolute control. In August 1910, while in solitary confinement, she simply stopped eating. Doctors tried to force-feed her by inserting tubes into her throat, but she resisted with the strength of a madman. This was a gruesome mirror irony of fate. She was killing herself in the same way she had killed her niece. She died silently. No confessions, no remorse. She took the secret of Ozzy's last minutes with her to the grave. When her heart stopped, she turned into a skeleton, just like her victim. Virginia Wardlaw, the matriarch and architect of evil, escaped earthly justice to face divine judgment, leaving her sisters to deal with the consequences. Virginia's death broke the remaining sisters' defense. Without their leader, Mary Snyder and Caroline Martin turned into frightened, pathetic old women. Their unity collapsed. The spider fight in the jar began. Caroline, Ozzy's mother, tried to shift all the blame onto the deceased sister. "It was all Virginia," she insisted during interrogations. "We were afraid of her. She forced us." The trial of Caroline Martin in January 1911 became the final act of the tragedy. Prosecutors did not seek the death penalty, understanding that before them was a deeply ill woman. Caroline pleaded guilty to manslaughter. The judge, looking at this ruined woman in black, pronounced the sentence: 7 years in prison. For a Southern aristocrat, this was tantamount to life imprisonment. But prison was not the worst punishment. The worst was what happened to their property. While the sisters sat behind bars, creditors began tearing apart the remnants of their lives. An auction took place. It was the most cynical event in East Orange history. Everything left in the House of Death went under the hammer. And here the dark side of human nature manifested. People came not for furniture, there was almost none. They came for souvenirs. The crowd fought for the right to buy the chair the murderer sat on. Personal letters, old books with Virginia's notes, even kitchen utensils were sold. Particular frenzy was caused by that very zinc bathtub. Legend has it that it was bought for a fabulous sum to exhibit in a dime museum as the death tub. Things that once symbolized the Wardlaw family's pride turned into fairground curiosities. Family portraits, college diplomas, handmade lace, all this went for pennies into the hands of gawkers eager to touch evil. The dynasty's history was sold off in pieces, turning into dust and anecdotes. Caroline Martin did not survive prison. Her mind, already fragile, finally clouded completely. She was transferred to the state psychiatric hospital in Trenton. There, in a padded room, she spent her last years rocking an imaginary child in her arms and whispering Ozzy's name. She died in 1913, forgotten by all. The third sister, Mary Snyder, proved the most resilient. She managed to avoid serious punishment thanks to technical legal nuances and the fact that all the blame was placed on Virginia and Caroline. She was released. But it was freedom in hell. Mary was left alone, without money, without family, with a surname that became a curse. Her son, Fletcher, Ozzy's husband, fled and never contacted her. She became a ghost. No one wanted to rent her housing. No one wanted to shake her hand. She wandered the streets, a living reminder of what greed does to people. The Great Fall was complete. From the empire that included a respected college, southern plantations, and million-dollar ambitions, not even a gravestone remained. Ozzy Snyder's body was buried at Mount Hope Cemetery, and for a long time, there was not even a marker on her grave. The family had economized on her in life and economized after death. Everything the sisters so desperately tried to preserve, status, wealth, exclusivity, crumbled to dust. Instead of gold, they got the lead of prison bars. Instead of respect, hatred and mockery. Instead of eternal memory, a place in criminology textbooks as an example of inhuman cruelty. Their mansion in East Orange stood empty for a long time. Local boys avoided it, telling each other that at night 3 black figures could be seen in the windows. The house, like the family, died, but its aura continued to poison everything around. This was the end of an era, but this story has one more, final dimension. Echo. How these events resonate in our time, and why more than 100 years later, we still talk about the Sisters in Black. After all, the evil born in that house did not disappear without a trace. It transformed. The story of the Sisters in Black did not end when the prison gates closed, or when the last nail was driven into Caroline Martin's coffin lid. The true end of the story is what remained after. The irony of the Wardlaw family's fate is that they so desperately sought to preserve their name for the ages that they were willing to kill for it. And they succeeded. Their name is remembered. But not as educators and aristocrats, but as a synonym for monstrous, unnatural greed. More than 100 years after the events in East Orange, we must ask the main question: what physically remains of their ambitions? In the state of Virginia, in the city of Christiansburg, the buildings of the former Montgomery College, where Virginia Wardlaw once reigned, long ago changed their purpose. The walls that were supposed to educate the nation's elite now hold only silence.
Local legends say that in these corridors one can still encounter the ghost of a stern woman in black who checks if the beds are neatly made. This has turned into folklore, a scare story for tourists. The great pedagogical empire has become just a point on the map for mysticism enthusiasts. And what about the Golden Child, the little son of Ossie Snyder, who was born in the midst of this tragedy and given to strangers? His fate is the only bright, though bitter, note in this symphony of horror. The boy survived. He survived precisely because he was not needed by his aunts and grandmother. For them, he was an extra expense, an obstacle. He was given to a foster family, and he disappeared from history. He grew up under a different name, far from the poison of the Wardlaw surname. He lived an ordinary, quiet life, something his mother and father were deprived of. The heir to the empire received the most valuable inheritance, anonymity and normalcy. But the loudest echo of this story resonates in pop culture. The case of the Sisters in Black became one of the cornerstones of the genre we now call true crime. In 1909, newspapers covered this trial just as avidly as streaming platforms today produce series about maniacs. People lined up for newspapers to learn new details from the House of Death. Many film and literature historians draw parallels between the Wardlaw sisters' story and the famous play, and then the film, Arsenic and Old Lace. In this black comedy, two sweet old ladies kill lonely men out of pity by treating them to poisoned wine. Of course, in the movies it's presented with a smile, but the real prototype, Our Three Sisters, shows that there's no room for comedy in life. Reality is always scarier than fiction. Virginia, Mary, and Caroline were not sweet old ladies. They were predators who used their respectable appearance as camouflage. This plot, monster with an angel's face, became a classic trope. From Alfred Hitchcock to Stephen King, we see echoes of that drama that played out in the cold bathroom in New Jersey. The Wardlaw sisters showed the world that evil does not always look like a bandit with a knife. Sometimes evil wears a mourning veil, quotes the Bible, and has impeccable manners. Today's viewer will find in this story a frightening connection to modernity. We live in the era of social networks, in the era of Instagram reality, where everyone tries to create a perfect picture of their life. The Wardlaw sisters were pioneers of this phenomenon. They created an offline filter, expensive dresses, haughty looks, conversations about high society. But behind this filter hid dirt, hunger, and murder. They taught us that the pursuit of status can become a deadly disease. They were so afraid of appearing poor that they became murderers. They were so afraid of society's condemnation that they committed a crime for which millions condemned them. The mansion in East Orange, that very house number 89, was demolished. The city tried to erase the physical memory of the tragedy. New houses were built in its place, where new families live, who may not even know that 100 years ago on this patch of land, the fate of an entire dynasty was decided. But the earth remembers. At Mount Hope Cemetery, where Ossie Snyder rests, there is now silence. Her life was short and full of pain, but it was precisely her death that destroyed the house of cards of lies. She became an unwitting martyr, whose death tore the masks off her executioners. In the finale, we return to where we began, to the paradox. Virginia Wardlaw dreamed of the immortality of her lineage. She wanted the Wardlaw name to be pronounced with bated breath, and she achieved it. Today, a century later, we still talk about them. We analyze their actions, we write scripts about them. But instead of admiration, we feel horror. This is a lesson for all of us. Wealth is not numbers in an account or antique furniture. Wealth is warmth in the home, children's laughter, freedom from fear. The Wardlaw sisters died in poverty and shame, although they had everything to live happily. They chose to seem rather than to be, and that choice became their sentence. The story of the Sisters in Black is complete. The case is closed. But every time we see a perfect family that tries too hard to convince the world of its well-being, somewhere in the depths of memory surfaces the image of 3 women in veils, sitting on overturned crates in an empty, cold house.